If I could rewind to that first morning at Lake Cock, I'd tell myself to floor it, keep driving. But hindsight, a luxury the doomed can't afford. The first thing that struck me about Lake Cock wasn't the eerily still water or the mountains, looming like inquisitive titans. It was the silence. Not a peaceful quiet, but a profound, unnatural hush that made my ears ache. No birdsong, no buzzing insects, no rustling wind through the trees. Just the drone of our rental truck slicing through air that felt too dense, too heavy. "Noah, look at this place," Hannah breathed from the passenger seat, her voice filled with a wonder I hadn't witnessed in months. "It's straight out of a postcard." She was right. The town unfolded before us in perfect concentric circles around a lake so black it resembled a hole ripped through the earth. 47 houses, I'd later learn, each meticulously maintained with white picket fences and flower gardens blooming with impossible vibrancy, despite the October chill. We pulled into the driveway of 23 Birch Lane, and before I'd even killed the engine, they materialized. The first was an elderly woman with snow-white hair and piercing blue eyes. She emerged from the house next door with purposeful strides, followed by a man in his 40s whose smile seemed too flawless to be genuine. Behind them came a nervous-looking woman in a white coat and a family of 4. "Welcome, welcome," the elderly woman's voice carried with unnatural strength. "We've been expecting you." I set down the box I was carrying, a cold dread settling in my gut. "Expecting us?" "Word travels fast in small towns," the man with the perfect smile said, extending his hand. "Pastor Divine, and this is Margaret Thorne, our unofficial welcome committee." Within 15 minutes, 12 townspeople had appeared, each bearing cleaning supplies or covered dishes. They moved with an efficiency that hinted at careful orchestration, assembling our furniture and organizing our belongings with seamless coordination. "This is incredible," Hannah laughed, watching 3 men wrestle with our bed frame. In Seattle, we barely knew our neighbors' names. I watched Margaret orchestrate everything with subtle gestures and couldn't shake the feeling that they'd rehearsed this many times before. That evening, the entire town convened in the community center for what Margaret called a proper welcome dinner. The hall buzzed with conversation as we entered, but the instant we appeared in the doorway, a complete hush fell. 847 pairs of eyes turned toward us in perfect unison. We were seated at the head table like honored guests, every resident facing us in neat rows. The attention felt suffocating, but Hannah beamed beside me, clearly thrilled by the warm reception. "Friends," Margaret announced, addressing the room, "tonight, we welcome Noah and Hannah to our community. As is our tradition, I'd like some of you to share your blessing stories." Tom Henderson, the father we'd met earlier, stood first. 5 years ago, I lost my job in Anchorage, came here with my family, broke and desperate. His voice resonated clearly through the silent hall. Within 1 week, I had 3 job offers, better pay than I'd ever made. The room murmured approval in perfect harmony, hundreds of voices blending into a single sound. Mrs. Chun, an elderly Asian woman, rose next. "Terminal cancer diagnosis in Seattle. Doctors gave me 6 months." She paused, smiling serenely. "Been in complete remission for 5 years now. Clean scans every time." More murmured approval, the same harmonic tone as before. A young couple in their 20s stood together, the Washingtons. The husband introduced them. Our marriage was falling apart when we arrived. Constant fighting, headed for divorce. His wife nodded, taking his hand. "Now we're expecting our 3rd child. Happier than we've ever been." I was starting to see the pattern. Each person stood at precisely the same moment, spoke for exactly the same duration, and sat down as the communal murmur reached the same pitch. It was like watching a meticulously choreographed performance. Dr. Reeves stood next, her hands trembling slightly. "I lost my daughter in Seattle. Car accident." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Came here broken, ready to end everything. This community saved my life, gave me purpose again." The murmur that followed was softer, more sympathetic, but still perfectly synchronized. An elderly man with kind eyes rose slowly. Lost my wife of 47 years to Alzheimer's. Watched her forget my face, our children, everything we'd built together. He wiped his eyes, his voice thick with grief. Here I found peace. The pain became manageable. More residents shared their stories. Financial ruin transformed into prosperity. Chronic illnesses miraculously cured overnight. Broken relationships healed completely. Each story followed the same template. Desperation, arrival in Lake Cock, miraculous transformation. How wonderful! Hannah whispered to me, tears welling in her eyes. It's like this place really does heal people. But I was watching the faces around us. Beneath their smiles, I saw something else. A desperate intensity, as if they were trying to convince themselves as much as us. Their eyes never left our faces, carefully gauging our reactions to every word. Pastor Divine stood last, his smile somehow brighter than all the rest. Lake Cock takes care of its own, he said, his voice carrying an unsettling resonance. Always has, always will. Those who embrace our community find blessings beyond imagination. The entire room nodded as one, hundreds of heads moving in perfect synchronization. Of course, he continued, his smile flickering almost imperceptibly. Not everyone appreciates what they've been given. Some people ask too many questions, poke around where they shouldn't. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What happened to them? I blurted out before I could stop myself. Pastor Divine's smile returned, but his eyes remained cold and hard. They usually realize it's best to move on, find somewhere more suitable to their temperament. Margaret stood quickly, breaking the palpable tension that had filled the room. Before we conclude, I want to share our most important community guideline with Noah and Hannah. She turned to us, her expression carefully neutral. Margaret's voice was grave, serious. We have one simple rule here in Lake Cock. We respect each other's quiet hours. Never answer your door after 10 p.m. The entire room went perfectly still. Not just quiet, but frozen, as if every single person had stopped breathing at the exact same moment. That's specific, I managed, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Wildlife, Dr. Reeves said quickly, a little too quickly, I thought. Bears mostly. They wander through town at night. But I couldn't help but notice several residents unconsciously touch wooden crosses or other protective items that hung from their necks. A few of the children stared at us with wide, frightened eyes, until their parents pulled them close and held them tight. It's for everyone's safety, Margaret continued, her gaze never wavering from mine. The rule has served us well for many years. Those who follow it prosper. Those who don't. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implied threat hung heavy in the air, thick like smoke. Of course, Hannah said brightly, seemingly oblivious to the rising tension in the room. We wouldn't want to disturb anyone. The collective sigh of relief was almost audible, hundreds of people exhaling together in perfect harmony. Walking home under the inky blackness of a moonless sky, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we were being watched from behind every darkened window. They're wonderful people, Hannah said, linking her arm through mine, her voice full of genuine admiration. Did you see how healthy and happy everyone looked? When was the last time you saw a community that genuinely cared about each other like this? Back at the house, I set up my work equipment while Hannah began to unpack our belongings. Everything connected flawlessly, internet speed that was impossible for rural Alaska, devices linking automatically to networks that hadn't existed before we arrived. This is amazing, I called to Hannah from my makeshift office. Better connection than downtown Seattle. Everything here is better, she replied, and there was something in her voice, a contentment so complete it sounded almost unnatural, too good to be true. She was asleep within minutes, breathing deeply and peacefully for the first time in months, it seemed. I lay awake, listening to the unnerving silence outside, obsessively checking the security monitors I'd insisted on installing. Scrolling through the footage, I paused, my blood running cold. In one frame, just for a fleeting moment, there was a shadow near the treeline that didn't belong, tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that were wrong, that hurt to look at. I rewound the footage, desperate to see it again, but the shadow was gone. No gaps in the timestamp, no missing seconds, as if it had never existed at all. I told myself it was just fatigue, my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of travel and settling in. But I spent the rest of the night watching those monitors, wondering what the Kowalskis had really been running from, and why a simple rule about not answering doors after 10 p.m. required such desperate emphasis. Somewhere deep in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that I should have kept driving, that we should have turned around and gone back. The next 3 weeks in Lake Cock were the best of our lives. That should have been my first warning, a bright red flag waving in my face. By the end of our second day, I'd landed 3 new clients, each offering contracts worth more than I'd made in the previous 6 months combined. The first call came at 7 a.m. sharp, a tech startup in Portland, practically begging for my consulting services. The second arrived before I'd even finished my morning coffee, a Fortune 500 company somehow finding my contact information despite my website supposedly being down for maintenance. The third appeared in my inbox with a subject line that made me do a double take. Dream project. Name your price. This is incredible, I told Hannah, practically shoving the contract figures on my laptop screen in front of her face. It's like every business decision I've ever wanted to make is suddenly falling perfectly into place. Hannah looked healthier each morning, her chronic migraines completely gone, her energy levels higher than I'd seen in years. She seemed to be thriving here. She joined the women's book club, started attending morning yoga sessions with Margaret, and somehow convinced Mrs. Chun to teach her traditional Chinese cooking. Our relationship, which had been strained by months of city stress and financial pressure, felt renewed in ways I'd thought were impossible. It's this place, she said, stretching in our bed with a contentment I hadn't seen since our honeymoon. A deep sigh of satisfaction. The air, the people, the slower pace of life. We should have done this years ago. Every morning we walked to the town diner for breakfast, where a table was mysteriously always reserved for us despite never making reservations, as if they were expecting us. Different groups of townspeople would join us, sometimes the young Washingtons with their adorable children, other days Dr. Reeves and Pastor Jeremiah Devine, occasionally elderly couples who shared stories of their own miraculous transformations, their own journeys to Lake Cock. The conversations seemed to follow patterns I was beginning to recognize, a script they had all memorized. Each resident had their moment of crisis, their arrival in Lake Cock, and their subsequent blessing, the turning point in their lives. But underneath their gratitude, I sensed something else lurking, a desperate need to convince us, and perhaps even themselves, that their good fortune was permanent, that it wouldn't be taken away from them. On our 5th morning, Dr. Reeves slid into the booth across from us, her hands noticeably steadier than I'd seen them before, a good sign. "How are you both settling in?" she asked, her smile more genuine than the practiced expressions I'd grown accustomed to seeing. "Wonderfully," Hannah said, cutting into perfectly fluffy pancakes that tasted like childhood memories, a taste of nostalgia. "My migraines haven't returned once. In Seattle, I was getting them 3 times a week. It was debilitating." Dr. Reeves nodded, but something flickered across her face, a shadow of something I couldn't quite place. "The mountain air is healing here. Have you always been the town doctor?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation towards something less rehearsed. 23 years now," she said, her voice dropping slightly, losing some of its warmth. "Lost my daughter in Seattle. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. Her hands began their familiar trembling, a nervous tic. Came here to heal, to find purpose again." "I'm so sorry," Hannah said, reaching across the table to touch Dr. Reeves's hand, offering a gesture of comfort. "This community saved my life," Dr. Reeves continued, her grip tightening on Hannah's fingers, her voice taking on an almost desperate tone. "Gave me everything I needed. A new practice, patients who appreciate my care, a place where tragedy couldn't follow, a fresh start." But as she spoke, her eyes kept darting toward the diner's windows, as if checking for something or someone outside, a sense of paranoia. The book club meetings quickly became a highlight of Hannah's week, something she looked forward to with great anticipation. 15 women gathered in Margaret's living room every Thursday evening, discussing novels with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor, a sense of devotion. I found their reading list curious, to say the least. Everything dealt with themes of sacrifice, community loyalty, and the price of paradise. "They're so well read," Hannah mentioned after their third get-together. "Margaret has this amazing library, filled with books I've never even heard of, but somehow feel like I've always wanted to read." "What kind of books are we talking about?" I inquired. "Stories about places just like this, small-town communities that truly flourish because everyone understands their role and their responsibility to the greater good of all." Her eyes had gained an intensity one didn't quite recognize in her. "It makes me realize how incredibly selfish we were back in the city, thinking only about our own individual problems." On Sunday mornings, Pastor Devine would invite me to join the men's fishing group down at the lake. 8 of us would stand along the shoreline, each with our rods and tackle boxes, discussing everything from the local history to potential business opportunities. What struck me wasn't the fact that we never actually caught any fish. The lake seemed completely lifeless, but how none of the men seemed to even care about that fact. "Best fishing spot in Alaska, bar none," Tom Henderson insisted, casting his line into water so still it looked like black glass. "Been coming here every single week for the past 5 years. Ever catch anything out here?" I asked. The men exchanged knowing glances, the same synchronized look I'd noticed at that community dinner. "It's not about the fish at all," Pastor Devine said, his perfect smile never faltering. "It's about the peace, the meditation, the feeling of being part of something larger than ourselves. Some folks come here expecting immediate gratification," added an elderly man named Peterson. "They want results right away, but they don't understand the patience that's required." What happened to them, though? I found myself asking, though I wasn't even sure why I was asking. The silence stretched on long enough to become uncomfortable and awkward. Finally, Tom Henderson spoke up. "They usually realize that Lake Cock just isn't for them. They end up finding somewhere more suited to their expectations. The Kowalskis seemed happy enough when they first arrived," I ventured. Pastor Devine's smile flickered ever so slightly, until they started asking questions that didn't really need asking. That evening, Hannah and I actually made dinner together for the first time in months, moving around our kitchen with an ease that felt nothing short of miraculous after years of scheduled chaos. She hummed softly while chopping the vegetables. Actually hummed, something she hadn't done since our early dating days. "The Hendersons invited us to their anniversary party next weekend," she said, her voice bright with anticipation and excitement. 20 years of marriage, and they still look like newlyweds. I watched her arrange flowers that had appeared mysteriously on our doorstep that very morning, her movements graceful and unhurried. The change in her was truly remarkable, but something about it nagged at me. It wasn't just the complete absence of stress. It was almost as if she'd become a more perfect version of herself, polished and optimized in a way that felt just slightly artificial. "Hannah," I said carefully, "do you ever wonder why everyone here is so uniformly happy all the time?" She paused thoughtfully, considering the question with an expression I'd never quite seen before, serene, almost blissful. "Because they've found what we're all looking for," she said simply. "A place where people genuinely take care of each other, where community actually means something, where life works the way it's supposed to." Her answer was so complete, so final, that I felt foolish for even questioning it in the first place. That night, while reviewing my work emails, I noticed something quite odd. Every client communication, every project milestone, every technical solution was progressing with almost supernatural efficiency. Code that should have taken weeks to debug ran perfectly on the very first try. Servers that typically crashed under load-handled traffic without even a hiccup. Even my most difficult clients had become reasonable, accommodating, almost eager to approve my proposals. I told myself it was simply karma, a well-deserved reward for years of struggle and city stress. But as I scrolled through weeks and weeks of perfect professional victories, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that nothing in life ever goes quite this smoothly. Around midnight, checking the security monitors out of habit, I noticed something that made me pause. The timestamp showed 12:17 a.m., but in one frame, just for a fleeting moment, there appeared to be a figure standing at the very edge of our property, tall, motionless, positioned exactly where the streetlight's glow ended and the darkness began. I rewound the footage, studying each and every frame carefully. The figure was there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to register its impossible height and wrong proportions, but brief enough to question whether I'd actually seen anything at all. When I looked up from the monitor, Hannah was standing in the kitchen doorway, her eyes reflecting the screen's pale light. "Can't sleep?" she asked, but her voice carried an odd quality, as if she were speaking from a great distance. "Just checking the system," I said. "Everything's fine." She nodded and returned to bed, moving with the same graceful certainty that had characterized all her actions since our arrival. I sat alone in the darkness, wondering why a town that had given us everything we'd ever wanted felt like it was slowly taking something important away. 3 weeks into our new life, I realized I hadn't questioned a single blessing we'd received. Success, health, happiness, community, all delivered with such perfect timing that it felt almost choreographed. And perhaps that was the most unsettling realization of all, that paradise, when it arrived exactly as ordered, felt somehow profoundly wrong. Outside, the lake remained perfectly still, reflecting nothing but darkness. If I thought the golden days in Lake Cock were too good to be true, the night I broke the silence shattered whatever peace we'd built. It started quietly enough, a normal late-night work session that would change everything. By our 21st day in Lake Cock, I was deep into a project crisis that demanded my full and undivided attention. A major client server had crashed during their peak hours, and fixing it required overnight work with their technical team. Hannah had gone to bed early, exhausted from another day of community activities. Book club preparation, afternoon tea with Margaret, and helping Mrs. Chen organize the church harvest festival. The house felt different after 10 o'clock, colder, despite the heating system running perfectly. The silence outside was so complete it seemed to press against the windows like something alive. Even the digital clock seemed to tick more loudly, marking time. Time marched forward with an unsettling precision. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the silence shattered with 3 deliberate knocks. The sound, sharp and patient, knifed through every room of the house. Each knock echoed at precisely 3-second intervals, delivered with an authority that brooked no argument. My blood ran cold as Margaret's warning resurfaced in my memory. Never answer the door after 10 p.m. But exhaustion, a heavy shroud, had dulled my senses. 4 hours spent wrestling with code, 3 cups of coffee, and a lifetime of ingrained habit took over. I was halfway to the door before reason could catch up with instinct. Hannah remained still, lost in the unnatural slumber that had taken hold since our arrival. Peaceful, too peaceful, as if an unseen force ensured she remained undisturbed. I opened the door and stepped into a waking nightmare. The porch was empty, the pristine snow reflecting moonlight in patterns so stark they burned the eyes. But leading away from our doorstep were footprints unlike any I had ever witnessed. Each track was impossibly long, almost 2 feet in length, and disturbingly shaped, as if formed by feet that bent in ways human anatomy could never allow. They stretched directly toward the lake, spaced too far apart for a normal stride. Then the shadow moved. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of moonlight playing through the bare trees. Then the darkness shifted, coalescing, and I saw it with stark clarity. 8 feet of pure wrongness standing at the edge of our property where the streetlight surrendered to the encroaching blackness. The entity was vaguely humanoid, yet stretched into proportions that made my mind recoil in horror. Arms too elongated, legs that bent backward at impossible angles, and a torso that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. But it was the head that froze the very marrow in my bones. What I had initially perceived as a skull split open along hidden seams like a flower crafted from bone and teeth. The opening revealed row upon row of needle-sharp fangs that descended into a throat so deep it seemed to stretch into infinity. The sound it emitted, a wet grinding noise like metal scraping against bone, would haunt my dreams for months to come. Then the eyes opened, not just where eyes should naturally reside, but dozens of them scattered across its entire form. Each one different, Some human, some animal, some things I could not even begin to categorize. They opened in sequence, creating a constellation of malevolent awareness that focused solely on me. The entity did not speak. It had no need to. I understood with chilling clarity that by opening the door, by acknowledging its presence, I had granted it permission. The rule was not simply about privacy or quiet hours. It was a barrier, and I had just shattered it. I slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, my heart hammering with such force I feared it would burst from my chest. When I peered back through the peephole, nothing remained. But the footprints lingered, leading away into a darkness that seemed deeper, more profound than before. Sleep was now an impossibility. I spent the remainder of the night checking locks, reviewing security footage, desperately attempting to convince myself that I had hallucinated the entire encounter. But when morning finally arrived, the evidence could not be denied. The town had undergone a transformation overnight. Walking to the diner for our usual breakfast, I noticed the difference immediately. No friendly waves from neighbors tending their gardens. No warm smiles from shopkeepers opening their stores. Instead, I caught glimpses of faces peering from windows, watching, judging, afraid. The diner that had welcomed us every morning for 3 weeks was suddenly crowded. Every table occupied by townspeople who had never before eaten breakfast there. Our reserved booth was taken by a family I did not recognize, their eyes following our every movement with undisguised suspicion. "Excuse me," I said to Sarah, the waitress who had served us countless meals. "Is there anywhere else we could sit?" She looked right through me as if I were invisible. "We're at capacity," she said flatly, then turned away to attend to customers who had arrived after us. The grocery store was even worse. Mrs. Patterson, who had chatted warmly with us for weeks about her grandchildren and her garden, stood behind the counter with her arms crossed and her face set in stone. "We're closed," she announced the moment I approached with our usual items. "The sign says you're open until closed." Her voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. Behind me, other customers whispered among themselves, their voices ceasing abruptly the moment I turned around. The words I caught were fragmented. "Broke the rule. Endangered us all. Should have known better." The gas station attendant claimed the pumps were broken. The post office had mysteriously closed for system maintenance. Dr. Reeves's office canceled Hannah's appointment without explanation. Our internet service, once impossibly fast, began cutting out during important client calls. Hannah noticed the changes but interpreted them differently. "Maybe they're just having a bad day," she said, her voice carrying that new quality of serene certainty. "Small towns have moods sometimes. It'll pass." But I could see the confusion clouding her eyes when children were pulled inside as we walked past their houses. The Henderson twins, who had always run to greet us, now watched from behind curtains with expressions of genuine terror. That evening, Margaret appeared at our door. She looked older than her 68 years, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something akin to desperation. Her hands trembled as she clutched a covered dish, her flimsy excuse for the visit. "We need to talk," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be watched. "Not here. Too many eyes. Meet me at the old church in an hour." The abandoned church stood on the outskirts of town, its steeple reaching towards stars that seemed dimmer than before. Margaret was waiting in the front pew, a flashlight casting dancing shadows on walls covered with strange symbols I had never encountered in any religious text. "You opened the door," she stated without preamble. It wasn't a question. "How did you?" "Because I've seen this before." Her voice cracked slightly. 17 times in 47 years. Families who thought they knew better, who believed the rules didn't apply to them. She told me everything then, laying bare the town's dark secret. The pact they'd forged during the brutal winter of 78, when economic ruin and relentless snows had pushed them to the edge of oblivion. It was Pastor Divine's predecessor who discovered the entity in the lake's blackest depths, an ancient, ravenous thing that offered prosperity in exchange for a periodic tribute. "It doesn't feed on flesh," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "It consumes something else, life force, soul, whatever you want to call it. Leaves the body intact, but steals everything that made it human. The agreement, she explained, hinged on a barrier, a permission-based magic if you believed in such things. As long as no one answers their door after 10 p.m., it can't enter our homes, can't directly touch our families. But once that barrier breaks, she shuddered violently, it has free reign. How long do we have? I asked, dread tightening its grip. Days, maybe a week if you're lucky. It likes to toy with its food first. Margaret reached into her purse, extracting an old, worn leather journal. These are accounts of past violations. The patterns are always the same. The journal chronicled horrors that defied comprehension. Families driven to madness by supernatural events, children who wandered into the lake and were never seen again, bodies drained of blood but bearing no visible wounds. Is there any way to stop it? Margaret's laugh was bitter, devoid of hope. Stop it, child? We made a deal with something we didn't understand, something that has been waiting in that lake longer than human memory. You don't stop a force of nature. You either feed it or become the meal. There has to be something, I insisted, grasping at straws. There is one possibility. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. The new moon. For 3 hours during the darkest night, it retreats to the lake's deepest point to rest. If you could leave during that window, when's the next new moon? 5 days. 5 days to survive something that had already claimed 17 other families. The manifestations began that very night. I woke to find handprints on the inside of our bedroom windows. Enormous, the fingers too long, the joints bending at impossible angles. Hannah slept soundly through it all, even when I tried to rouse her. When I wiped at the prints with a cloth, they smeared like blood, but left no residue. By morning, they were gone. Our security cameras started recording static after midnight, then automatically deleting the files. Kitchen items moved overnight. Coffee mugs migrating from cupboards to windowsills, chairs pulled away from tables, cabinet doors standing open despite having been closed before bed. But the worst were Hannah's episodes. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., she would rise from bed and walk toward the back door. Her eyes remained closed, but she moved with unwavering certainty, never stumbling or hesitating. When I tried to wake her, she would turn toward me, her face radiating a disturbing serenity. He's calling, she would say, her voice familiar, yet somehow alien. The lake father is calling his children home. Hannah, wake up, I pleaded. I am awake, she'd reply, then blink and look around, confused. Noah, why am I in the kitchen? Each episode left her more distant, more susceptible to the supernatural explanations I desperately tried to deny. On the 4th day, Pastor Divine called an emergency town meeting. The community center was overflowing, every resident present and accounted for. We were escorted to the front row. Like defendants in a trial, hundreds of eyes burning with accusation and fear. Friends, Pastor Divine began, his perfect smile replaced by righteous anger. We face a crisis that threatens everything we've built. The covenant has been broken. The lake father is awake and hungry. Murmurs of agreement spread through the assembly, growing in intensity. For 47 years, we've honored our agreement. We've sacrificed when necessary, maintained the rules, and been blessed beyond measure for our faithfulness. His voice carried an unnatural resonance that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Now that blessing is in jeopardy because of selfishness and disrespect. He turned to face us directly, and I caught a glimpse of something inhuman flickering behind his eyes. The choice is simple, he continued, his voice hard. Either they make amends for their violation, or we all suffer the consequences. The crowd began to chant, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. As it grew louder, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The shadows on the walls were moving independently, reaching toward us with grasping fingers. Dr. Reeves stood suddenly, her face pale but resolute. There has to be another way. The chanting stopped abruptly, hundreds of heads turning toward her in perfect synchronization. Sarah, Pastor Divine's voice carried a warning tone. You of all people should understand the price of defiance. I lost my daughter to this thing, she said, her voice shaking but unwavering. I won't watch it happen again. Margaret rose from her seat, then Tom Henderson, then a scattering of others throughout the crowd, perhaps a dozen people out of 847. The room split visibly, the majority glaring at us with undisguised hostility, while a small minority positioned themselves between us and the larger group. So be it, Pastor Devine said, his smile returning with predatory intensity. Those who stand with them share their fate. That night, the entity began hunting in earnest. I saw it first through our bedroom window, a towering shadow moving through the streets with impossible fluidity. Its head had split completely open, revealing an endless throat lined with teeth that moved like living things. The eyes covering its body blazed with inner light, each one focused on our house. It moved closer with each passing hour, growing bolder as the town's protection dissolved. By dawn, it was standing in our backyard, perfectly still, but undeniably present. The townspeople had become its accomplices. Our car wouldn't start, sabotaged by Tom Henderson, who'd once shared fishing stories with me. The phone lines were cut by the utility company, throat lined with teeth that moved like living things. The eyes covering its body blazed with inner light, each one focused on our house. It moved closer with each passing hour, growing bolder as the town's protection dissolved. By dawn, it was standing in our backyard, perfectly still, but undeniably present. The townspeople had become its accomplices. Our car wouldn't start, sabotaged by Tom Henderson, who'd once shared fishing stories with me. The phone lines were cut by the utility company. The worker who'd upgraded our internet had ensured our isolation. Roads leading out of town were mysteriously blocked by construction crews, working only under the cloak of night. We were trapped, hunted by something ancient and hungry, in a town that had coldly decided we were acceptable losses for their continued prosperity. Margaret's resistance network met us at the abandoned church, now our only sanctuary in a community that had become utterly hostile. The new moon is tomorrow night, she whispered, showing us a map marked with escape routes. 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. That's your window. Through the cracked windows of the church, I could see the entity circling our house like a predator, patient and relentless. Hannah sat beside me, humming a tune I'd never heard before, her eyes reflecting starlight that wasn't there. Tomorrow, I promised myself, though I wondered if we'd survive until then. The lake father was calling, and Hannah was beginning to answer. The final truth arrived in hushed whispers and agonizing confessions, delivered by people who'd carried secrets too heavy to bear alone. Dr. Reeves arrived at the abandoned church first, clutching a medical bag that rattled ominously with every step. Her hands shook worse than usual as she spread photographs across the altar, images I immediately wished I could unsee. These are what's left when the lake father finishes feeding, she said, her voice barely audible in the stone silence. The photos showed bodies that looked like discarded husks, skin intact but somehow deflated, eyes open but utterly empty of anything recognizable as human. They're not technically dead, she continued, pointing to medical readings with trembling fingers. Heart stops, brain activity ceases, but something essential is just gone, consumed. Margaret entered with the Henderson family trailing behind, their faces etched with grief that looked decades old despite their youthful appearance. How many? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. 17 in 47 years, Dr. Reeves replied. Sometimes it's satisfied with one. Sometimes it wants more. The Chun family's daughter 2 years ago, the Morrison boy before that. My own. Her voice broke completely. Tom Henderson cleared his throat, the sound echoing off stone walls covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the flashlight's glow. We had 3 children when we came here. Jake, Emma, and Sarah. Lisa Henderson's composure cracked. Sarah was 6, blonde hair, loved to draw pictures of flowers. She pulled out a small photo, a beautiful little girl with a gap-toothed smile and eyes full of life. When the Kowalskis broke the rule 5 years ago, the community decided someone had to pay the price. We volunteered her, Tom said, the words falling like stones. Told ourselves it was for the greater good, that one life could save hundreds. The lake father was gentle with her, we were told. Quick. But it wasn't quick, Dr. Reeves interjected. I examined her afterward. The feeding process takes hours. It drains them slowly, savoring every moment of life force it steals. Margaret's voice cut through the horror like a blade. Pastor Devine's predecessor found the entity during the winter of 1978. Town was dying, businesses closing, families leaving, children starving. Jeremiah Devine made contact during the winter solstice when the lake ice was thinnest. The first sacrifice was voluntary, she continued. Jeremiah's own son, Marcus, 16 years old, terminal cancer. The entity promised to take his pain away in exchange for services. The prosperity that followed convinced everyone it was worth the price. And you've been feeding it ever since? I said, the accusation hanging heavy between us. What choice did we have? Tom's voice cracked with desperation. You've seen what this place gives us. Health, wealth, happiness beyond measure. Every parent here has watched their children thrive in ways impossible anywhere else. Until it's time to pay, I replied. Through the church's broken windows, I could see the entity circling our house like a predator marking territory. It had grown bolder since nightfall, no longer hiding in shadows. Its head hung open like a grotesque flower, the throat beyond pulsing with bioluminescent light. The eyes covering its body had multiplied, creating a constellation of malevolent awareness that never stopped watching. It's hunting actively now, Margaret observed, following my gaze. Once permission is granted, it becomes more substantial, less bound by the rules that normally contain it. As if responding to her words, the entity turned toward the church. Even at this distance, I could feel its attention like ice water in my veins. Several eyes along its torso focused on our location, and I had the horrible certainty that it knew exactly where we were. The new moon window, I said urgently. Tell me everything. Margaret consulted an ancient lunar calendar, her finger tracing symbols that predated any religion I recognized. Tonight, 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. For 3 hours, it retreats to the lake's deepest point to rest, digest whatever passes for sleep in something like that. Why only then? The entity exists partially in our dimension and partially in something else. The new moon creates a gravitational weakness that forces it to consolidate in one location. Her explanation sounded clinical, but her eyes held the terror of someone who'd seen too much. You'll have exactly 3 hours, maybe less if it senses the escape attempt. Dr. Reeves handed me a bag of supplies. Nothing from the town, no clothes, no food, no personal items touched by Lake Cock's influence. Everything here is blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective. What about you? Hannah asked. She'd been silent through most of the revelations, humming that strange tune under her breath. Why don't you all leave? Someone has to maintain the balance, Margaret replied sadly. If the entire town abandons the covenant, it will follow its prey anywhere. Geography means nothing to something that exists between dimensions. That's not fair, Hannah protested. But her voice carried an odd quality, distant, as if she were speaking from underwater. Fair. Tom Henderson laughed bitterly. Child, nothing about this place has ever been fair. We made that exists between dimensions. That's not fair, Hannah protested. But her voice carried an odd quality, distant, as if she were speaking from underwater. Fair. Tom Henderson laughed bitterly. Child, nothing about this place has ever been fair. We made a deal with something we didn't understand, and now we're all trapped by it. At midnight, the entity began its final hunt. I watched through our bedroom window as it approached the house with deliberate patience. Its limbs had extended grotesquely, beyond any pretense of human anatomy, reaching 20 feet in length and bending at joints that defied nature. The head had split completely now, revealing the full, horrific depth of that impossible throat lined with teeth that moved like living things. Beside me in bed, Hannah sat up, her eyes reflecting a light that wasn't there. He's coming, she said, her voice retaining its familiar timbre, yet somehow alien. "The lake father is coming home. Hannah, stay with me," I pleaded, but she was already rising, moving toward the back door with a sleepwalking grace that chilled me to the bone. The entity pressed against our house like a living shadow, and I heard the sickening sound of wood beginning to splinter. It was coming inside. I grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her toward the front door, but she resisted with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "I need to go to him," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that physically hurt to hear. "He's been so patient, so kind. It's time to go home." The back door exploded inward, frame and all, with a deafening crash. The entity flowed through the opening like liquid darkness, its multiple eyes focusing on Hannah with unmistakable hunger. The sound it made, part purr, part growl, part static electricity, filled the house with vibrations that made my teeth ache. I dragged Hannah out the front door as Pastor Jeremiah Devine's voice boomed across the town square, calling the faithful to arms. "Find them, bring them back. The covenant must be honored." Flashlight beams crisscrossed the streets as half the town mobilized for a manhunt. But Margaret's resistance network was ready for us, creating a human chain that led from shadow to shadow toward the edge of town. "This way," Dr. Reeves whispered, leading us through backyards and side streets, while behind us, the entity's roar shook windows in their frames. The old church had become our staging area. Margaret waited with a pre-1978 pickup truck, its engine already running. "Strip completely," she commanded. "Everything off. These clothes are from before the covenant. They can't be tracked or influenced." We changed quickly in the church basement while above us something massive moved across the roof. Dust rained down with each footstep, and I caught glimpses through the windows of eyes peering down at us. Too many eyes in configurations that defied anatomy. "It knows," Margaret whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We have to go now." The truck's engine struggled to life as Pastor Devine's faction surrounded the church. Through the windshield, I could see him standing in the doorway, his perfect smile replaced by something inhuman and terrifying. When he opened his mouth to speak, his jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth identical to the entity's. "You cannot escape what you've awakened," he called, his voice carrying impossible harmonics that resonated deep within my bones. "The Lake Father's hunger spans dimensions. Geography is irrelevant. Time is meaningless." Margaret gunned the engine, and we burst through the crowd of townspeople like a stone through water. In the rearview mirror, I watched Pastor Devine's form begin to elongate and twist, his human facade dissolving into something that matched the entity's proportions. The mountain road stretched before us, winding through passes that seemed to close in with each mile. Behind us, impossible sounds echoed through the darkness. The roar of something massive giving chase, gaining ground despite the truck's speed. "It's following," Hannah observed calmly, her face pressed against the rear window. "He's beautiful when he runs, like liquid starlight." "Don't look at it," Margaret commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. But Hannah's eyes remained fixed on whatever pursued us through the darkness. The entity appeared in my side mirror, bounding alongside the truck with strides that covered impossible distances. Its head was fully open now, the throat within blazing with bioluminescent fire. When it turned toward our vehicle, I saw Pastor Devine's face swimming in that organic display, his features distorted but recognizable. Then dawn broke over the mountain peaks, and the entity simply vanished. We drove in silence for 6 hours before stopping at a gas station in Fairbanks. The attendant looked at us strangely. 3 adults in ill-fitting clothes, one of whom kept humming under her breath and staring at shadows that moved wrong. "You folks okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "We're fine," I lied, signing the credit card receipt with hands that still shook, just passing through. But as we drove away, I noticed our reflection in the station's windows. We cast shadows, normal human shadows, all except Hannah. Her shadow stretched too long, bent at impossible angles. And for just a moment, I swore I saw it split open like a flower made of darkness. 3 months later, we'd built a new life in Seattle. My business had recovered. Hannah seemed healthier than ever, and we'd both started therapy to process what we'd convinced ourselves was a shared delusion brought on by isolation and stress. I was washing dishes in our apartment kitchen when I noticed the shadow on the wall. Our lamp cast Hannah's silhouette as she read on the couch, but there was another shadow beside hers, taller, with arms that bent wrong and a head that split like flower petals. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. Hannah sat alone, absorbed in her book, seemingly oblivious. When I looked back at the wall, both shadows were gone, leaving me questioning my sanity. That night, I heard the knocks again. 3 of them, patient and deliberate, coming from inside our apartment walls, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Hannah stirred beside me, her eyes still closed. "Aren't you going to answer?" she asked in her sleep, her voice barely a whisper. I realized then, with a chilling certainty, that we'd never really escaped Lake Cock. We'd simply brought it with us, a haunting stowaway in our minds and souls. I'm writing this account now, 6 months later, from our 4th apartment in as many months. The knocks follow us everywhere, an inescapable reminder of our past. Hannah has started sleepwalking again, always toward the nearest body of water, drawn by an unseen force. Last night, I found her voice barely a whisper. I realized then, with a chilling certainty, that we'd never really escaped Lake Cock. We'd simply brought it with us, a haunting stowaway in our minds and souls. I'm writing this account now, 6 months later, from our 4th apartment in as many months. The knocks follow us everywhere, an inescapable reminder of our past. Hannah has started sleepwalking again, always toward the nearest body of water, drawn by an unseen force. Last night, I found her standing on our balcony. She was speaking to something I couldn't see, her words hushed and reverent. "He's patient," she confided when I guided her back inside, her eyes distant. "The Lake Father is very patient. He knows we'll answer eventually. Some covenants can't be broken by geography. Certain hungers can't be escaped by distance. And sometimes, when the shadows lengthen just so, I catch glimpses of eyes watching us, reflecting from every surface in our home." Hannah questions why I've developed the habit of triple-checking every lock before bed. I keep silent about the unsettling knocks I hear within the walls, and the way our neighbors have begun to smile with an unnatural, unsettling breath when they encounter us. I don't tell her that last night, when the knocks echoed at precisely 11:47 p.m., I nearly succumbed to the urge to answer.